Have you ever felt the sharp sting of disrespect so deep that it shakes you to the core? That's what I felt the moment I looked out my window and saw something unbelievable happening on my very own patio. Imagine pouring years of sweat, hard work, and money into making your home perfect, only to discover to women neighbors, no less deciding that your private property was suddenly their personal event hall. Yes, the infamous HOA Karen sisters, always complaining, always controlling, always acting like the neighborhood was theirs. But this time, they crossed a line I could never forgive. They didn't just throw a party. They didn't just use my yard. They hosted a full-on wedding. Chairs, flowers, even a cake right there on my patio, without my permission, as if my property belonged to them. I stood frozen, if you're shocked, watching strangers flood my space, music blasting, and the sisters smugly directing the entire thing. Their arrogance was unbearable, but what they didn't know is that I had been preparing for people like them all along. Months ago, tired of constant HOA harassment, I installed a little upgrade to my patio, a tilt mechanism hidden beneath the floorboards. It wasn't dangerous, but it was definitely humiliating for anyone unlucky enough to be standing on it when activated. And as I stared at the chaos, rage simmering, one thought echoed in my mind. They wanted to make a spectacle. Then let me give them a show they'll never forget. This wasn't just about property. This was about respect. And by the time the wedding march started, I had already made my decision. Today would end with laughter, just not the kind the Karen sisters expected. It was a Saturday morning, the kind of morning where the sun shone a little too brightly and the air carried that crisp sharpness of autumn, making every sound travel across the neighborhood. I had woken up early, planning to spend the day quietly on my own. My patio was my sanctuary, a space I had designed with care. Freshly polished wooden boards, flower pots lined neatly along the railing, and a comfortable lounge chair right in the corner. It was my favorite spot to enjoy peace away from the chaos of our HOA-run neighborhood. Or so I thought. With a steaming cup of coffee in hand, I pulled open the blinds to take in the view, but the sight that greeted me nearly made me drop the cup right onto the floor. My jaw slackened, my heartbeat quickened, and for a moment, I wondered if I was still dreaming. My patio, my private property, had been transformed into something out of a wedding catalog. White folding chairs lined in neat rows faced a makeshift altar draped in fabric. Balloons and ribbons fluttered in the morning breeze. A long table stretched across one side, stacked with trays of food, plates, and bottles of champagne. I blinked twice, but nothing changed. At first I thought I was mistaken, that perhaps I had wandered into some strange parallel universe where my home doubled as a public park, but the sound of laughter and voices soon reminded me that this nightmare was real. Strangers, people I had never seen before, were already walking up the driveway and stepping onto my patio like they owned the place. They carried flowers, gifts, and bottles of wine, their chatter filling the air as if this were the most normal thing in the world. And then I saw them, the Karen sisters. They stood in the middle of the patio, dressed identically in pastel-colored dresses that looked more expensive than tasteful. Their matching hairdos, stiff and sprayed to perfection, glinted in the sunlight. They were pointing fingers, shouting directions at everyone like they were royalty hosting a grand ceremony. These two had always been a thorn in my side. Self-appointed rulers of the HOA, they thought every driveway, every mailbox, and every lawn decoration needed their approval. They loved enforcing rules on others but never seemed to follow them themselves. And now, unbelievably, they had crossed into my property as if it were their personal playground. I froze, stunned at the sheer audacity. The sisters hadn't asked for permission. They hadn't even bothered to leave me a note. No, they had simply decided that my patio was the perfect place to host a wedding, and they had gone ahead and arranged it. One of the sisters, the taller one, noticed me standing by the window. She didn't flinch, didn't look guilty. Instead, she smiled smugly, lifted her hand in a little wave, and mouthed something like, "Don't worry, we'll clean up." The nerve of her. The message was clear. This wasn't an accident, and they weren't going to stop. They believed they had the right. I shut the blinds and stood there, gripping my coffee mug so tightly I thought it might crack. My pulse raced. The anger bubbled up, sharp and hot. They had crossed lines before, complaining about the length of my grass, questioning the color of my front door, demanding I move my trash cans 5 feet to the left. But this was different. This was trespassing. This was theft of privacy. This was humiliation, right on my doorstep. But as the anger surged, so did a slow, wicked smile. They didn't know. They didn't know that months ago, fed up with their constant harassment, I had installed a little surprise under my patio. A tilt mechanism. It wasn't dangerous, just a mechanical system that could shift the angle of the floor when activated. I had originally designed it as a petty little defense against nosy intruders or bored teenagers who might sneak into my yard. Never had I imagined the Karen sisters would throw a wedding on top of it. But now it felt like fate had delivered the perfect opportunity. Still, I didn't rush. Timing mattered. If I burst out there now, yelling and demanding everyone leave, I would look like the crazy neighbor. The sisters were experts at twisting narratives, always making themselves look like victims. No, I needed patience. I needed to let them dig their own hole deeper, so I waited from behind the blinds. I watched the scene unfold like a bizarre play staged for my private amusement. Guests continued to arrive, their voices echoing across the street. Some of them glanced at my house suspiciously as though they half expected me to storm out. But when I didn't, they relaxed, assuming this event had my blessing. Tables were set, drinks poured, and the DJ began testing his speakers, blasting music across the neighborhood. My neighbors peeked out from their homes, some shaking their heads, others laughing, but none daring to intervene. Everyone knew what the Karen sisters were capable of. The bride and groom finally appeared late in the morning. I didn't know them, had never seen their faces before. They looked young, nervous, and slightly overwhelmed. For a brief second, I almost pitied them. They were likely pawns in the sisters' scheme. Maybe the sisters had convinced them that they had access to a perfect venue for free. Maybe they didn't even realize they were standing on stolen property. But the pity faded quickly. They hadn't asked either. They hadn't bothered to check, and ignorance didn't excuse disrespect. By the time the minister arrived, everything was in place. The guests settled into their chairs, fanning themselves with programs. The sisters bustled around like overexcited hens, fixing tablecloths and repositioning decorations, pretending to be the stars of the show. I stood in the shadows, watching, every nerve in my body buzzing with anticipation. My finger itched to press the hidden switch to send the entire patio into chaos, but I forced myself to wait, because this wasn't just about teaching the sisters a lesson. This was about timing, and if I had learned one thing from living under their constant scrutiny, it was that revenge was sweeter when served at the perfect moment. So I leaned back, sipped the last of my lukewarm coffee, and whispered to myself, "Enjoy your little wedding, ladies. The real show hasn't even started yet." The day grew louder with every passing minute. The steady hum of guests chatting, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter echoed off the walls of my house. From my hidden vantage point inside, I could hear every detail. The Karen sisters had transformed my patio into a full-blown wedding venue, and the audacity of it all gnawed at me with every second. My sanctuary, my private retreat, had become a stage for their arrogance. Yet, instead of exploding with rage, I felt an unusual calm, because I knew something they didn't. The ceremony was about to begin. The guests were finally ushered into their seats by the sisters, who strutted back and forth like they owned the world. Their matching pastel dresses shimmered in the daylight, and their tight smiles hid the smug confidence that radiated from them. I watched as one of them adjusted the ribbons on the altar, barking at a young boy to hold the basket of flower petals properly. The other sisters scolded a caterer for not placing the napkins at a perfect angle. They weren't just hosting this wedding, they were controlling every second of it, micromanaging every detail to cement themselves as the stars of the show. Then came the music. The DJ began to play a gentle instrumental track, a sappy string arrangement that drifted across the neighborhood. Heads turned as the bride appeared at the edge of my driveway. She wore a flowing white dress that caught the sunlight like glass. Her arm was hooked through her father's, who looked proud but uncomfortable, as though he sensed something wasn't quite right. The guests rose to their feet, clapping and smiling, snapping photos with their phones. From where I stood behind the curtains, I could see the bride's nervous smile, the small shake in her hands as she held her bouquet. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. She was walking into a ceremony she thought was beautiful, not realizing the ground beneath her feet was literally rigged to collapse. My grudge wasn't with her, not directly. It was with the Karen sisters who had orchestrated this entire sham. But still, she was part of the invasion. She was standing on stolen ground, and in my mind, that made her complicit. The groom waited at the altar, shifting from one foot to the other, tugging at the sleeves of his suit. He was tall and thin, his nervous grin betraying his lack of comfort under the stares of so many people. When he caught sight of the bride, his face lit up. For all the absurdity of the setting, I couldn't deny the sincerity of that moment. He loved her, that much was clear. But sincerity didn't change the fact that my property had been stolen for their big day. The ceremony began. The minister, a balding man in his late 50s, cleared his throat and lifted a small book. His voice carried smoothly across the crowd as he welcomed everyone. The guests quieted, leaning forward, eager to witness the vows. The bride and groom clasped hands, exchanging nervous smiles, and just behind them, lurking at the edges of every photo and video, the Karen sisters beamed with self-importance, as though they were the true stars of the event. I narrowed my eyes. This was the perfect setup. My tilt mechanism ran directly beneath the altar and the first 3 rows of chairs. One flick of the hidden switch, and the entire wedding party would slide into chaos. But I didn't press it. Not yet. My gut told me to wait. If I struck too soon, the impact wouldn't be as devastating. The memory of their smug wave from earlier still burned in my mind, and I wanted that arrogance to shatter at the peak of their triumph, so I bided my time, watching as the minister guided them through the opening words. The bride repeated her lines softly, her voice trembling, while the groom's words came out stronger, steadier. The guests sniffled, dabbed at their eyes, whispered about how beautiful everything was. From across the patio, one of the sisters shot me another glance, her smirk wider this time, as if to say, "See, we own this place now." My fists clenched. My jaw tightened. But still, I didn't move. The vows stretched on, and I listened as the couple made their promises. They spoke of love and patience, of standing by each other through hardship, of loyalty and forgiveness. Noble words, but in the back of my mind they felt like a cruel joke. Here they were, pledging honesty and respect, while the very ground they stood on had been taken without either. The hypocrisy twisted my sympathy into a sharper edge of anger when the time came for the exchange of rings. The sisters bustled about, making sure the photographer got the perfect angle. They whispered loudly to the minister, interrupting him, insisting he speak slower so they could capture every moment. Their arrogance knew no limits. They had turned my patio into their stage, my home into their backdrop, and they had the gall to act like they were blessing me with their presence. My hand drifted to the hidden control switch. My thumb hovered over the button. The moment was almost right. Almost I wanted the tilt to hit at the exact second that would etch itself into every memory, every photograph, every whispered retelling of this day. Then came the minister's voice, steady and loud. "Do you take this man?" The crowd held its breath. The bride whispered a trembling "I do." Applause erupted, cheers filling the air. The groom responded in kind, his voice stronger, his confidence rising. The guests clapped louder, some whistling, some shouting encouragement. And through it all, the Karen sisters clutched each other's arms, their faces glowing with satisfaction. They thought they had won. They thought they had taken from me and made themselves legends in the neighborhood. But I knew better. The minister raised his hand. "Then, by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd erupted. Chairs scraped, feet stomped, hands clapped. The bride and groom leaned forward, closing the space between them, lips trembling as they prepared for their first kiss as a married couple. Phones lifted into the air, cameras zoomed in, and everyone held their breath, ready to witness the moment of triumph. That was when my thumb pressed the button. The moment my thumb pressed down on the hidden switch, time seemed to slow. At first, nothing happened. The guests were still clapping, the bride and groom still leaned toward each other, and the Karen sisters still basked in their stolen glory. Then, like the deep creak of a ship's hull bending under pressure, the patio groaned. A subtle shift rippled through the floorboards, almost imperceptible at first, and then the tilt mechanism kicked fully into gear. The change was instant. The rows of neatly placed chairs lurched forward. Guests gasped as their seats began to slide, legs scraping across the wooden boards. Champagne glasses tipped, spilling golden liquid across white dresses and pressed suits. Someone shouted, "What's happening?" But their voice was drowned out by the chaos erupting all around. The patio floor dipped sharply to one side, sending plates of food tumbling from the tables. The three-tiered wedding cake, balanced proudly at the edge of the table, wobbled like a drunk dancer before launching. Forward in a spectacular fold, it landed squarely on the Karen sisters. The explosion of frosting and fondant was almost cinematic. White icing smeared across their pastel dresses, chunks of cake clinging to their hair and faces. One sister shrieked like a banshee, clutching her ruined curls, while the other slipped backward in the mess, her arms flailing as she landed with a thud. The crowd gasped, some rushing forward, others laughing in shock, while the sisters scrambled in sticky humiliation. But the chaos didn't stop there. The bride, mid-kiss, stumbled forward as the altar shifted. Her groom tried to catch her, but his polished shoes slid across the tilting boards. They both toppled into the front row of guests, arms and legs entangling in a mess of tulle and satin. The minister, wide-eyed and clutching his book like a lifeline, lost his balance and tumbled sideways, his glasses flying off his face. The DJ, panicking, grabbed his sound equipment, only to watch helplessly as the speakers slid right off the edge of the patio, crashing onto the grass below with a sickening crack. Screams mixed with laughter, the sound carrying across the neighborhood. Guests tried to stand, but the tilt sent them tumbling again and again, slipping on frosting, drinks, and scattered petals. A woman in high heels shrieked as she fell backward, her legs kicking wildly in the air. A man in a suit, his tie askew, cursed loudly as his chair collapsed beneath him. Children squealed, half terrified and half delighted, treating the sliding floor like some chaotic carnival ride. And there I was, standing behind my curtains, laughing so hard tears filled my eyes. This wasn't dangerous. I had designed the tilt carefully. It was steep enough to cause chaos, but not so steep anyone would be truly hurt. The humiliation was the weapon, not injury. And judging by the scene unfolding before me, my invention had delivered flawlessly. The sisters' screams pierced above the rest. They tried desperately to regain control, waving their cake-covered arms, shouting orders at the guests as though they still had authority. But no one listened. Their carefully planned wedding was a circus now, their reputation sinking faster than the frosting dripping from their hair. They stumbled across the patio, slipping every few steps, their voices rising in panicked shrieks. The bride finally scrambled to her feet, her once pristine gown streaked with champagne and dirt. Tears streamed down her face as she clung to her groom, who was equally battered, his suit stained with frosting and grass. Their perfect day had collapsed before their eyes, ruined in a single, spectacular moment. The minister, still searching for his glasses, muttered prayers under his breath, trying to escape the chaos without being trampled. Guests began fleeing, some clutching their belongings, others slipping and tumbling as they scrambled for the driveway. One man lost his shoe, another carried a toppled centerpiece under his arm like a trophy, and a woman shouted that she was going to call the police. But most were too busy trying to save themselves from the spectacle to take any action. Through it all, I stood hidden, watching, savoring. The Karen sisters, however, weren't about to accept defeat quietly. Covered in cake and frosting, their dresses stained beyond repair, they spotted me. Through the chaos, through the laughter and the screams, one of them locked eyes with me at the window. Her mouth opened wide, unleashing a shrill accusation. "You did this," she screamed, pointing a frosting-covered finger toward my house. Her sister joined in, shrieking sabotage. "He ruined everything." Their voices cracked with rage and humiliation, but the guests weren't listening anymore. Some were too busy laughing, others too busy rushing to their cars. If anything, their accusations only made them look more ridiculous, screaming like lunatics while covered head to toe in frosting. I let the blinds fall shut, muffling their screeches. A grin spread across my face, my heart pounding with exhilaration. Months of dealing with their arrogance, their constant meddling, their smug superiority, all of it had led to this. And finally, I had turned the tables. Outside, the chaos began to thin. Cars revved as guests fled the scene, their tires screeching down the street. The DJ abandoned his broken equipment, storming off in a fury. The minister hobbled away, still muttering, his glasses crooked on his face. The bride and groom, devastated, climbed into the back of a decorated car, their faces pale with shock. The "just married" sign flapped sadly in the wind as they drove away, their dream day crumbling into nothing but embarrassment. And then there were the sisters. They stood in the wreckage of my patio, their matching dresses ruined, their hair clumped with frosting, their faces streaked with mascara. They clung to each other for balance, their earlier arrogance stripped away completely. The smugness that had defined them was gone, replaced by pure humiliation. They looked around desperately, but there was no one left to admire them, no one left to obey them. Their empire of control had collapsed in one messy, frosted heap. They screamed my name again, threatening lawsuits, calling me evil, promising revenge. But their words carried no weight now. They had trespassed, humiliated themselves, and destroyed the very thing they sought to control. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for a moment, breathing in the sweet satisfaction. I had waited for the perfect timing, and it had paid off. My patio was a mess, yes, sticky, stained, and scattered with debris, but it was my mess, and cleaning it would be worth every second of watching their downfall. For the first time in months, I felt free. Free from their smug looks, their constant demands, their endless rules. They had written their own downfall the moment they stepped onto my property. All I had done was give fate a little nudge, and as the last of the chaos faded, I whispered to myself, never mess with my patio again. The morning chaos eventually gave way to an eerie quiet. My patio, once spotless, now looked like the aftermath of a food fight gone nuclear. Cake smeared across the boards, drinks soaked into the wood, and chairs lay toppled at odd angles. Flower petals, trampled and torn, were scattered across the yard. For a long time, I stood at my window, just breathing in the silence. It was the silence of victory, the kind that comes only after a storm has spent all its fury. But I knew that silence wouldn't last. The Karen sisters weren't the type to lick their wounds quietly. By noon, they had already started their campaign. From my window I watched them stomp up and down the street, still wearing their frosting-stained dresses, their voices sharp as knives. They cornered anyone who would listen, neighbors watering their lawns, joggers passing by, even the delivery driver who'd made the mistake of pausing his truck. Their shrill voices carried accusations. Each retelling of the disaster painted me as the villain who had sabotaged a beautiful, once-in-a-lifetime celebration. They ruined the bride's dream day. One of them shrieked, "He's a monster. He planned it, I swear." The other cried. Their arms flailed dramatically, cake crumbs still clinging to their hair like sad confetti. But the more they screamed, the less convincing they looked. People listened politely, nodded here and there, but their eyes betrayed amusement. I could almost hear the unspoken thought running through every neighbor's mind. "Well, you brought this on yourselves." By late afternoon, the HOA president, a gray-haired man named Mr. Donnelly, knocked on my door. His face carried the stern look of someone who had been cornered by the sisters one too many times. I opened the door slowly, leaning against the frame with a calmness I didn't entirely feel. "Good afternoon," he began stiffly. "We've had complaints." "Let me guess," I replied dryly. "From the Frosting twins." A flicker of a smile tugged at his lips, though he quickly hid it. "From the sisters?" "Yes. They're saying you intentionally destroyed a wedding held on your property." "On my property," I repeated, letting the words hang heavy between us. Key phrase there, Donnelly. My property. Did I invite them? Did I approve it? Or did they just waltz in and turn my patio into their personal event hall? His shoulders sagged. He knew I was right. Everyone did. But the sisters were relentless, and as HOA president, he had to at least pretend to take their complaints seriously. They want to file a formal grievance, he admitted. They're pushing for fines, maybe even legal action. I chuckled, shaking my head. They'll need more than frosting stains and wounded pride to win a case. Trespassing is trespassing, Donnelly, and I've got the proof. At that, I motioned toward the security camera perched discreetly above my garage. It had captured everything: the setup, the arrival of guests, the sisters' smug wave, and the chaos that followed. Donnelly's eyes flicked toward it, and for the first time, I saw real relief cross his face. "You have footage?" he asked, crystal clear. I confirmed. That seemed to settle it. He nodded, muttered something about needing to handle the sisters diplomatically, and left. I knew what that meant. He was going to let them rant, let them file their silly grievance, and then bury it under the weight of undeniable evidence. But the sisters weren't ready to give up the next morning. I woke to find a letter shoved under my door, written in dramatic, looping handwriting. It accused me of emotional terrorism, demanded a public apology, and threatened to sue me for irreparable psychological damage. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. It was so over the top it could have been comedy. Still, they weren't entirely powerless. Over the next few days, they launched a smear campaign. They posted long rants on the neighborhood message board, painting themselves as victims of a cruel, jealous neighbor who couldn't stand to see love celebrated. They knocked on doors, passed out flyers accusing me of being a saboteur, and even called the local news, though thankfully no reporter seemed interested in covering a cake-stained patio drama. But here was the beautiful part. The neighborhood wasn't buying it. People had seen the truth. They had seen the sisters march onto my property without permission, ordering people around, acting like they owned the place. They had seen their smugness collapse into frosting and tears. And for once the community wasn't rallying behind them. At the grocery store, I overheard two neighbors chuckling about the wedding wipeout. At the gas station, someone nudged me with a grin and whispered, "Heard you served up sweet justice." Even the mailman gave me a thumbs up one morning, muttering, "About time someone put those ladies in their place." The sisters noticed too. Their arrogance dimmed. They still strutted around, still barked orders when they could, but there was a crack in their armor now. Every glare they threw my way was tinged with desperation, every complaint sharpened by the sting of humiliation. And yet, they refused to back down completely. They doubled down, demanding the HOA hold a special meeting to address the sabotage. Flyers went out, emails circulated, and the neighborhood was summoned to the clubhouse for what promised to be a showdown when the day came. The sisters arrived in full force, hair perfectly styled, dresses pristine this time, their expressions set in stone. They carried binders full of evidence, mostly messy, frosting-smeared photographs, and they strutted to the front of the room as though preparing to argue before the Supreme Court. I walked in calmly, carrying nothing but a flash drive. The meeting was tense at first. The sisters ranted and raved, accusing me of cruelty, of engineering the tilt as part of a long-term vendetta. They painted themselves as victims of harassment, martyrs of a neighborhood gone wrong. Their voices rose higher and higher, hands waving dramatically, until they were practically shrieking, and then, with the quiet confidence of a man holding the ace of spades, I plugged in the flash drive. The screen lit up with clear, undeniable footage: the sisters trespassing, the setup of the chairs and tables, the smug wave in my direction, the complete absence of permission or invitation. The room fell silent. Neighbors exchanged knowing looks. The sisters' faces drained of color. Their dramatic binders, their emotional pleas, all of it crumbled under the weight of hard evidence. When the video ended, Mr. Donnelly cleared his throat and said simply, "Case closed." The sisters sputtered, tried to argue, but the room wasn't with them anymore. No one clapped, no one nodded in agreement. Their empire of control had cracked, and for the first time, they realized they didn't have the neighborhood in their pocket. As the meeting adjourned, I walked past them slowly, offering a smile that was equal parts polite and victorious. "Better luck next time," I murmured. Their glares could have cut steel, but their power was gone. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. The sisters had been dethroned not by yelling, not by fighting, but by their own arrogance. They had handed me the weapon of their downfall, and I had used it with precision. As I walked home, the setting sun painted the neighborhood in gold. My patio would need repairs, yes, but as I stepped onto the sticky boards and looked around at the remnants of their disaster, I felt nothing but satisfaction. This was my home, my space, and I had defended it. And deep down, I knew one thing for certain: the Karen sisters would never, ever forget the day they tried to host a wedding on my patio. The days following the HOA meeting were strangely quiet. For the first time in years, the Karen sisters' voices didn't echo across the neighborhood like broken megaphones. Their usual routines: patrolling for trash cans placed too early, counting blades of grass on lawns, nitpicking the color of someone's shutters, seemed to vanish. They still walked the neighborhood, of course, but their strides lacked the bounce of confidence they once had. Instead, their eyes darted nervously, avoiding the stares and smirks of neighbors who now saw them for what they were: manipulators who had finally been humbled. The humiliation from the failed wedding clung to them like a second skin. Everyone knew. Everyone had seen. Even those who hadn't attended the HOA meeting had heard the story, passed along in whispers, then laughter, then open jokes. The sisters, who once thrived on being the self-proclaimed leaders of the community, were now the punchline of every conversation. And it wasn't because of MIT, it was because of their own arrogance. My patio, though still scarred with frosting stains and scratches, became a badge of honor. Whenever I stepped outside to sit in my lounge chair, neighbors would wave, smile, or casually remark, "Heard you gave them a taste of their own medicine." Some offered to help me scrub the boards clean, though I politely declined. I wanted the mess to linger a little longer. A reminder of the day justice had been served. The bride and groom never returned. Word spread that they had moved their honeymoon up early, desperate to escape the embarrassment of their ruined ceremony. I almost felt sorry for them, but only almost. They hadn't asked permission, hadn't respected boundaries, and in the end, they had paid the price for trusting the wrong people. Perhaps one day they'd laugh about it, but for now, the sting of humiliation was theirs to carry. The sisters, however, carried it far worse. Every time they left their house, they were met with polite but knowing smiles, the kind that cut deeper than open mockery. No one confronted them directly anymore, no one needed to. Their power was gone. Their reign of control had ended not with a bang of HOA rules, but with the crash of a wedding cake and the tilt of a patio they had no right to claim. Of course, they tried to recover. Flyers reappeared now and then, taped to mailboxes, calling for neighborhood unity and respect for authority, but no one read them. Some were torn down within hours. Others were scribbled over with sarcastic notes, "Cake anyone?" or "Watch your step." The sisters' authority had dissolved into ridicule, and nothing they did could piece it back together. One afternoon, about a week after the meeting, I was outside watering the plants along my patio railing when the taller sister walked by. She stopped at the edge of my lawn, her arms crossed, her face twisted with bitterness. Frosting stains were long gone, but humiliation lingered in her posture. "You think you won," she hissed. I set down the watering can, turning to face her calmly. "I don't think," I said evenly. "I know." Lips curled into a sneer. "This isn't over." "Then you've learned nothing," I replied. My voice wasn't angry, wasn't loud, it was simply and that seemed to sting more than any shouting match ever could. She glared for another moment before storming off, muttering under her breath. But I knew her threat was empty. The neighborhood no longer followed her lead. Without an audience, her voice had no power. That night, I sat on my patio under the glow of the setting sun, sipping coffee from my favorite mug. The boards were still stained here and there, but I didn't mind. Every mark told a story. Every scratch whispered of the day arrogance met its downfall. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the cool evening air, and realized something important. The patio hadn't just tilted that day. It had shifted the balance of the entire neighborhood. People had seen the truth, and once seen it couldn't be unseen. The Karen sisters had lost their grip, and with it, the weight that had pressed down on all of us for so long had finally lifted. As the last rays of sunlight stretched across my yard, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. For the first time in years, the neighborhood truly belonged to its residents, not to two women who thrived on control. My patio was mine again. My home was mine again. And respect had been restored in the most unexpected way. And as I closed my eyes, a smile spread across my face. Because I knew one thing for certain, the Karen sisters would never, ever dare to step onto my patio again.